Yeah, indeed, he's, 11 seats short, Bell. But being no doubt, Spain is waking up as a very European country in many ways this morning, with its politics fragmented, with it having to work through what type of government it is likely to see come out over the next couple of weeks. But this is a victory for the Socialists and for Pedro Sanchez. This was an election battle. It was framed very much about talking about the future and not the past. Very much his arguments: vote for the Socialists to keep the far right out, and that strategy does seem to have worked. While, as I say, this has been in many ways a very European election, the politics we're now used to across the continent, it has also been entirely dominated by a very Spanish issue, and that of Catalonia and what happens with the independence campaign there. It became an election about Spanish history and Spanish identity more than almost anything else. But ultimately what it did result in, it was an historic defeat for a party that has traditionally ruled this country, the Popular Party. It slumped to its worst ever defeat, even despite tacking to the right, despite focusing on that sense of Spanish identity in order to see off the far right. And so I think, as I say, Pedro Sanchez can claim victory in this, but as you say, it is not an absolute victory. Even with Podemos, it is unlikely that he is going to be able to form a government, 11 seats short, and that means he may well have to reach out to both Basque separatists, some independents, and potentially even the Catalans themselves, and that's where it gets tricky. The ERC in Catalan did very well last night, topping the poll, but the question, of course, Bell, is if they are to go back in some ways into an arrangement with the Socialists. Ultimately they brought it down a couple of months ago. What will they ask for in return? What concessions will they ask Pedro Sanchez for?
Of course, Vox, we've seen the far-right Vox party also a sort of highlight of the evening, them making gains in Parliament, 24 seats in Parliament. How big of a deal is that for Spanish politics? How much influence might they have there?
It is a big deal in the sense that, 6 months, a year ago, they really were nowhere. They first, of course, made a breakthrough in the regional elections in Andalusia at the end of last year, and since then they have clearly made a big mark in Spanish politics. Yes, they got 10% of the vote. It's not amazingly well. In some ways, actually, they did a little worse than had been predicted, at least at the start of last night, when people were talking about potentially them getting 40 seats. They got 24 in the end. But they won't be part, it looks now, of any kind of broad coalition of the right. The Popular Party's historic defeat has seen to that. But they did have an impact in two regards. First of all, they made the Popular Party tack to the right. They made this election a defining issue about Spanish identity. And they have changed the political game here. And they are now going to sit in this place, in the Spanish Parliament behind me. And all across Europe, we're seeing, sometimes for the first time in many, many decades, the far right sitting in national parliaments. I think there are only 3 now across Europe that do not have far right representations, and they are Ireland, Malta and Portugal. So Spain, as I say, his politics has now been defined very much like many other of its European countries.
Well, let's look at those European elections, because, of course, for the Spanish, voting is far from over. They've got municipal, regional and the European elections coming up next month. Is there anything we can glean from what happened over the weekend about what might happen across Europe in these upcoming elections?
Yeah, indeed, Belle. There's still an awful lot of horse trading to be done here in Spain. Things are far from settled. There is still political uncertainty, and, as you say, there are more elections coming up at the end of next month. And it'll be interesting to see whether there potentially might be some formulation of a coalition here. This is a country that is not used to, has never had a formal coalition. But when it comes to the wider context about what we can judge from this, when it comes to those EU elections taking place at the end of May, well, first of all, as I say, this is a national election. It has been, in some ways, dominated by the issue of Catalan independence and Spain's sense of identity and who it is, and that is pretty unique to Spain. There aren't many other EU countries that are facing that internal battle. But ultimately, actually, what it boiled down to was a battle that we are seeing play out in places like Italy and in Germany and indeed in France, and it is this sense of identity politics in some ways, about what it means to be, for example, a German or a French person. And kind of wrapped into that these wider issues that Vox campaign, for example, on migration, representation of minority rights, a frustrated sense from your ordinary Joe on the street, your ordinary Spaniard, that the main political parties had not been representing them very well. And again, that is a narrative that we're seeing to the rise in populism across Europe. And that is interesting, that there is this common narrative across the continent that I think we'll see a reflection in those European elections about that strong sense of national identity, potentially trumping in some regards European identity. But I think ultimately, like we've seen in Spain, the centre ground just holding on to ensure that actually those populist parties, whether they be on the right or the left, don't gain that much control, a significant impact, but not that much control in next month's elections.